Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Astuma Viddishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us. May our study be full of vigor. May our study be enthusiastic, full of enthusiasm. And may we work together well, and may we not cavil unnecessarily together. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. When I selected the subject, Women Saints of East and West, I didn't really realize the enormity of the task. And so I'm acting over the next hour more as a commentator of literature on various saints of East and West. And the topic is selected because yesterday was the International Women's Day. And so mainly when we highlight saints in the form of monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, of course they're all men. And very little attention is given to the women. But you see, throughout the history, as far as we can think, wherever there has been some form of intensive system in spiritual life, then as far as that has happened in history, there have been women of the highest character. In the ancient Vedic times, we have to take cognizance of the fact, women had equal status. They had equal opportunity. They were both given Upanayana. They were both given the sacred thread. There were women, two types of women. One group would have been studying and then would have been married, but the other group, the Brahmavadinis, would have studied permanently. So all the women had access, full access to proper spiritual training and access to the Vedas, and access also to engaging in Vedic ritual. You can easily see in the Ramayana how in the Uttarakhanda that Rama has no Sita, so he makes a golden image. So it was necessary for the wife to be there and partake in the ceremony. And we have many, many names highlighted to us in the Vedas of esteemed, scholarly, respected women. The classical dialogue between Yajnavalkya and Gargi is a great example of the fact that there were women rishis and sages. We see reference to Gargi, Vachaknya Vadav Titi, Salabha Maitreyi, among others, all mentioned in the Vedas. It was only really in the 11th century when the classical Sanskrit went into disuse and the age of the Puranas came, that women really had been barred from Vedic studies, the 11th century of this era. But this was revived because at that period there was a spontaneous bhakti movement, a movement of the heart, a movement of devotion. And so it was Pythagoras who mentions that the woman's heart is more inclined toward devotion and religious practice. So even in the West, as far back as ancient Greek times, this acknowledgement of the inherent spirituality and spiritual nature and the spiritual dispensation of women. So the traditions both in East and West, and also the monastic traditions in East and West, have encouraged women. In Buddhist time, there was a women's Sangha. In fact, Sangamitra, or Sangamita as it is in Pali, she was the eldest daughter of Emperor Ashoka. And she was known for her scholarliness. And we're talking of, 300 or so, 200 before the current era. And there was a great missionary movement that wanted to go to various countries, including what is now Sri Lanka. And because people wanted to join the Buddhist movement as nuns, there was nobody who could ordain them. It had to be a woman. And the emperor's daughter was sent. He protested, but she persuaded him, no, send me. And she did enormous work. She brought the original offshoot of the tree of where Buddha had his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, and she brought it to Sri Lanka. It is said to be the oldest living tree on the planet. And so she is much revered. She did a lot to establish the nuns there in Sri Lanka, a profound scholar, a profound organizer, and she brought the spirituality there. And her nature was seen to be pure. When she arrived in Sri Lanka, her radiance immediately had an impact. So there's this great Buddhist saint, this saint of the East, Sanghamitra, the daughter of Ashoka. In fact, she was the eldest daughter. And not only did she make an impact, but today, even the day that is celebrated or commemorated of the arrival of this branch of this tree has been identified, in fact, as the International Women's Day. But of course, to count up the number of saints and their lives that could inspire us, fortunately for us, will take our own lifetime to do, because they are numerous. When you look at the condition of modern life and see how secular life in developed countries has taken over and is starting to be revived in the developing countries. But in this developed world that we live in, there are too many distractions. Entertainment is the key obstacle to considering anything more serious in life. But behind it all is a great, great energy. Yesterday, I was talking to a conference, a youth conference, and I mentioned just in the aftermath of it, where we had informal discussions, that there was this great energy because there was great concern that the equality amongst women is not there. Much work has to be done. Should us men, was a question from a man, should we change our attitude and do something differently? And I pointed out that the whole of nature is registered in a feminine gender. I pointed out that we refer to the earth as Mother Earth. We refer to nature as Mother Nature. This is the motherly, feminine aspect that is there. And I said, we don't have to worry because we believe that this is energy itself, that what we call energy, that what Einstein called energy, is actually feminine. And that there is this great Shakti, this great movement of energy that will force things to unfold by themselves. We don't have to interfere with anything. Swami Vivekananda was keen to give women education. It was one thing that he felt was necessary. He didn't like the fact that there were two great evils still in India. And one was the oppression or the trampling of women. And the other one was the same to do with the poor. And he said these evils need to be removed. But by the same token, he was a great, great devotee of Shakti. And he learned this from the master, who was the very embodiment of the Kali Shakti. And so a new age dawned for many of us who are familiar and have encountered this 19th century movement. We will be convinced that this great energy is unfolding by itself, spontaneously. And at the end of the day, our Vedanta philosophy tells us experientially validated and logically indicated that our very inner nature has no gender. This internal self that our philosophy calls Atman self is neither male nor female. I sometimes joke with people and say, I'm half man and half woman. You see, my father was a man and my mother was a woman. And so this categorization of gender is our limited view. And when we have a penetrating vision and go beyond it, we can see the possibility of potentiality that comes out in sainthood. What is sainthood? I remember when I was very small, and people would ask, so what do you want to be when you grow up? I said, I want to be a saint. Because we were brought up with the lives of saints, men and women saints. These were people who had mystic visions. And in the Christian religion, it would be mystic visions of Christ, or mystic visions of the divine in some way, in some form, in Christian language and symbology. And as we develop, we see this common ground. So what is the characteristic of a saint? The great obstacle to this goal of freedom that we have is egoism. This is a great obstacle of I, me, and mine. And once we've gotten rid of that, then the vision of freedom is already automatically there. It manifests itself. It is revealed automatically. And so all of these great saints, men and women, would have gone through different systematic practices, but all of them had a great determination to go forward and a great determination for the truth. And some of their highways and byways are not ones that we would find pleasant. I see that there is a great saint that I heard about many, many years ago. Her sayings have become common parlance today because she was a great, great optimist. She was probably brought up in a Benedictine nunnery of some kind, but in an effort and in a resolve to live an intense spiritual life. That is, to create a set of circumstances that would act as a catalyst to propel us more toward this internal realization that we call God. In order to do that, she became an anchorite. An anchorite is somebody who voluntarily wants to be enclosed permanently. Typically, you go to a church building or some such thing, and they build a cell for you. And what that means is that appended to a church that happened to be St. Julian's Church in Norwich, they built a small addendum, a small room, maybe the rudimentary foundations were there already, and blocked it up, enclosing her in this. Of course, she had windows. One window opened up into the body of the church so that she could attend church services. And another window was there so that visitors could bring food. And more importantly, as her fame and saintliness grew, to discuss with her, to seek her counsel, to get some kind of aura that they felt was around her. And we commonly picture saints, men or women, with these great auras around them. These great, typically they're called halos. This kind of emanation of life indicating some form of magnetic field to which people are automatically drawn. And the description, for example, of Sangamitra is an example of how she arrives. And the description is that immediately they understood her intense purity just because they saw her face beaming. Jesus said, you cannot hide your light under a bushel or a bed. That means that once you have accessed this divine light within yourself, it emanates through the very pores of your skin. The face becomes like a sun shining out. And regardless of how good a speaker you are or bad a speaker you are, whether you are silent or whether you're not, still that internal, subtle, indefinable light and presence will be there. So that merely sitting in the company of such a person, you will get the sunshine, you'll get the radiance, and you'll go with an altered magnetic field, so to speak. So such a one was that. Sri Ramakrishna was described by Holy Mother as very good looking. There was one devotee in London who said, I was very puzzled because they said how beautiful Ramakrishna looked, and yet all the pictures show him. And in contrast to that, Swami Vivekananda is much more handsome. But they realized through meditation, the essence of Ramakrishna was that his light beamed through his very skin, and the Holy Mother describes this as he had a golden hue about him. His skin was the same color, golden color, as his amulet. So it was the same with all of these saints. Julian Norwich was a very interesting person. As I say, she was put into this anchorite state. And she had 3 basic wishes. And these are peculiar wishes. The one wish she had was that, and she lived in 1373, for your information as well. She was born there. She was peculiar theologically in as much as she saw God as a mother. This is why I have selected her in connection with International Women's Day. She saw God as a mother, and she was perhaps the first Christian, the first Roman Catholic anyway, who expressed it in this way and who wrote about it and believed that God feels no wrath, no anger towards mankind, but will one day make all things well. So her famous statement, now entrenched in literature and common parlance, is, all shall we be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And this is in relation to her final revelations that she had. She wanted to experience how this Christ felt, persecuted in agony on a cross. She wanted to experience the insight of being there during his passion and suffering, so that she could feel what he felt. Now, this is something that we should all do, not literally in connection with that, but when we have an Ishta Devata, a chosen ideal, particularly if that ideal is historical. Ishta Devata falls into 2 categories. One is non-historical and one is historical. Let's take, for example, on Thursday, we have Shivaratri in the night. Ratri, the night. This is a non-historical ideal, that it is not a human person that lived, but it is a set of concepts, revealed concepts in the depths of meditation, that when we reverse the process and meditate on that form, we come to a realization of what that Shiva is, transcending its very form. But every item that is being held, every posture that is being held, every expression, every background, ancillary background associated with this entity is an indicative of the essence of this. Shiva, for example, is commonly portrayed in 3 aspects. One is the Shiva Ling, that indicates the unseen, the invisible entity. Linga means a sign. You indicate by a sign. There is some presence there, emulating Mount Kailash. Mythologically, Shiva is supposed to sit on the top of it. But we can't see it. Above the clouds, we can't see it. And so we take the emblem of it, the symbol of it, and then we're able to think of the presence which is there, intangible to us, but indicated. Linga means a sign. Then there is the other form of Nataraja, dancing Shiva, with leg raised. If Shiva were to stand still, the whole universe would stand still. And this is the manifested dynamic aspect, which is the universe itself, not separate or different from that entity that sits and meditates. So these three aspects are there, connected with a non-historic Shiva. And we probably have more to say about that closer to Shivaratri time. But the historical type are these incarnations. Jesus, Buddha, Rama, Krishna, Ram Krishna, Chaitanya. All of these are seen to be, in some way or another, descending entities, avatars. That means entities that have descended from a cosmic mind, born of a cosmic mind. Whenever, from age to age, there is a need, whenever harmony has to be restored, this descent occurs and has its impact for the next 500 or 1,000, 2,000 years, etc. And it is these entities that we have to explore. How does this entity walk? What did they eat? For Christians, imagine now that you are standing there on the Sea of Galilee with this entity. And Julian of Norwich saw this Jesus as a mother. Isn't that interesting? See how many of the disciples of Ramakrishna also saw him as a mother, despite his gender. Gender meant nothing, but he had a motherly approach. In other words, he was abundant love. And so this Julian of Norwich saw this loving entity. There are many Christian saints who have seen it in this way, male and female. But Julian of Norwich declares it openly, in written form, that Jesus is a mother, that she feels this motherhood of God. We don't know how theologically comfortable people are with this, but that was her direct experience, and endorses the experience that we emphasize today, the motherhood of God. Because a mother, there's nothing higher than a mother's love. That is what we say. So Julian of Norwich took her place as an anchorite there and lived in a semi-monastic community in this way. And of course, we have to understand that she lived in a tumultuous time. Don't forget that in the period we are talking about, the 1330s, 1340s, there would have been a Black Death raging throughout the whole of Europe that decimated at least 1/3 of the European population. If you think that the COVID-19 crisis is a great, tragic pandemic, we are lucky to live in these modern times where vaccinations can be available and where knowledge of what is a virus, in other words, the cause of the pandemic, is known. But the Black Death, nobody had any idea. So a lot of superstition went in. And the superstition comes into the religion. What are we doing wrong? Are we displeasing God? Those kinds of feelings and attitudes take place. Particularly as you see people of all varieties, all types, be they monks, be they priests, be they lay people, be they peasants, be they noble people, and they're all suffering from this Black Death. And where she was, Julian of Norwich was placed as an anchorite, that very road would have been a way for removing corpses of the dead people. The first plague that she experienced, she was only 6 years old when it happened. And as I say, the road beside her church was used to remove the bodies of the dead from the subsequent plagues. And she probably would have heard the rumble of the carts go by. And then in her lifetime, there was 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War in Europe was something like what we register as World War II. The whole of the known world in turmoil. So that was a great opportunity for pessimism. The great 100 Years' War was between England and France. young men going off to war, young men dying. And then in her own church, there was a papal schism, each one declaring the other one to be anti-pope. And there was a famine, cattle disease. All this contributed to the forces that caused what was ultimately a peasants' revolt, a political revolt. And then John Wycliffe, those who understand the English history, and his followers, and they were all declared heretics and burnt at the stake. Some were burned and some were buried at that very church that she was an anchorite at, just by her church cell. So she must have been acutely aware of the sufferings of the time. And yet her message is optimistic, hopeful, because of her direct experience with God. Her desire to find union in God's love, she reported asking God for 3 graces. One was, I mentioned, the recollection of the Passion, so that she could feel or experience this crucifixion, along with this idea of any historic chosen ideal. We have to not just make friends, but understand them as a living presence. In the Bhagavad Gita, we're asked, somebody of steady wisdom, Sthita Prajna, how does he walk? How does he talk? See, I want to know, how does he sit? So if you are a Christian, you might want to think about all those things. What did the Jesus eat? What was his conversation? What were his teachings? How did he look? What was the smile that he gave? What was the loving, tender look he gave me? And then also, what were the sufferings he went through? She wanted to know all of that. Any devotee of Krishna will also want to know, how did he feel to be Radha and attain these great heights of intense devotion, that kind of bhava that is very rare to attain? How did the gopis weep for Krishna? Can I be one? Can I feel the despair of when he hides and doesn't reveal himself? Can I experience the joy of when we play and frolic together? Can I hear the music from his flute? All of these things are worthy of contemplation. So she wanted to actually experience this in the Christian context, to experience the crucifixion of Jesus as if she had been a witness, or even as if it were happening to her personally. And then the second wish she had was to experience an illness that was so severe that everyone would think she was dying. And this happened when she was 30 years of age. Because how can you be compassionate in the midst of all this turmoil, 100 Years' War, Black Plague? How can you be compassionate to people if you haven't undergone this suffering yourself? And then how to suffer like this in a non-complaining way, with a sense of fortitude and a sense of forbearance. And so at this age of 30, because Christ was 30 also when he suffered on the cross and when he was alive. So by experiencing the pains and terrors of such a serious illness, she felt that she could live more fully with God. And then the third grace that she asked, the third boon, was for 3 wounds which she characterized as the wound of contrition, that she would evaluate her life in order to correct it. The wound of compassion, that through the experience of sufferings, she would have infinite compassion for all humanity. And the wound of longing, with that the will, her will, and her God, the will, should be attuned. These are things that we all require. We all require a review of our status quo, our psychological status quo, the opportunity for adjustment. Not overly so, not with a sense of guilt, because she never had that. All this produced immense optimism in her. And so we all require this compassion, and we all require this longing. Sri Ramakrishna emphasizes this point by way of a story. How can I see God? When will I see God? A student asks the teacher. The teacher says, I will show you, come. He takes him to a river. And he says, enter into it. And immediately he plunges the student down in the water, not letting him up. Eventually, the student, he lets up and says, how did you feel? And gasping for breath, I felt I was going to die. When you have this longing for God, know that your realization is about to dawn. That kind of attitude. And so, Julian believed that the request for these three graces of God led her to the illness that she had and the subsequent visions. And these visions transformed her whole life. And these visions were answer to a question. Having seen her chosen ideal, she then got revelations in response to all her questions that she asked. 16 of these visions occurred. She writes a brief summary of them with 25 chapters, outlining her showings, as she calls her, and then some 20 years later puts these in greater detail, comprising some 86 chapters. Detailed explanations and elaborations of this. And interestingly enough, her first vision, she had a disclaimer. The disclaimer said, I'm just a woman, weak and frail. But in her second version, she says, she is now a confident counselor, and she does away with this statement of weakness. And with time for reflection, contemplation, and discourse with God as to their meaning, the meaning of these visions, she gains the status of a teacher, a counselor, a guru. She realizes that these visions are not just for her own edification, not just for her selfish fulfillment, but they are there, available for all people to learn how to seek God. And this is what makes her such a revered saint in England, not far from our own shores. Her emphasis, her definition of sin is unusual because how Christian theology emphasizes sin and guilt, she doesn't do it. Her emphasis is on forgiveness, and her concept is the motherhood of God. Some female mystics also report experiences of this motherhood in dreams and visions, but Julian went further in this vein, further than the great saints Augustine, Ansel, and even Bernard of Clairvaux, who had a great devotion to the aspect of Mary. And she goes and attributes this motherhood to God, and specifically to Christ, regardless of the generalization of gender. The love of a mother for her child. And she was really the first non-heretical writer to image the motherhood of God toward nurturing humanity. As truly as God is our Father, so truly is God our mother, she says. An extraordinary thing that we take for granted in Eastern traditions and Eastern saintliness. She had a great saying, sin is behovely, that is useful or necessary. But all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. This reflects basically her theology on sin. She argues that sin is necessary. It's not something that is an aberration. She mentions that, and she teaches that humans usually fall into this sin out of naivety, what we describe as ignorance, but not out of wickedness. See, there are no bad people, there are only bad behaviors. Our mistakes cause us to humbly seek the divine, and she says then that sin is necessary. She uses the old-fashioned word, behovely, as life is a school where we learn from our mistakes. And we can add to that, because the Eastern view of it is unlimited. Such compassion is there, that unlimited opportunities to learn and pass our university examinations of life. When she asked God in these revelations about the theological hell and purgatory entrenched in traditional Christian theology, she received no answer. And at the end of time, she believed, of course, that all will be well by the mystery of the divine, when all things will be made good again. She reported having a personal and reciprocal relationship with this divine, which will inspire all of us, in which she received insight and understanding as a result of these questions. But above all, she was optimistic, speaking of God's love in terms of joy and compassion, as opposed to law and duty and all the dourness that we could find in some of the more negative Christian theology. So for her, suffering was not a punishment that God inflicted. In the midst of all the plague and the pandemics and the Black Death, people viewed it in this way. It was a means he used to draw us closer to himself. This, of course, differed from the prevailing views of her time, that the plague was some kind of divine punishment for something that society had done wrong. It is God's will that we have three things in our seeking of his gift, she says. And the first is that we seek willingly and busily, without laziness, without sloth, without unskillful heaviness and vain sorrow. No negativity there. And the second, that we should abide with that divine steadfastly for his love without complaining and striving. There's a saying, what cannot be cured has to be endured, but to endure it willingly as a kind of flower offering, as a forbearance, with patience, with kindness, with compassion, and for others. And the third, that we trust him mightily with a fully sure faith. This trust issue we were discussing a little bit before we opened up this talk. You see, seeing God in another is one thing. Feeling God as the only presence there, that is what is necessary. Then all fear goes away and complete trust takes its place. The trust that all resources are available. The trust that our pilgrim journey that we call life is well catered for and looked after. That the birds of the air are fed, the lilies of the field are clothed. That all is well, that the supply is within us, and that ultimately we, spirit, are the supplier of all the grace. That knowing our great power, couched in feminine languages, Shakti, we can ourselves miracles perform. That we have to be sure of, not for the sake of gaining glory or reputation or status, but as an outpouring of compassion and love. So Julian's 16 revelations summarize as follows. The crown of thorns and God's love for all that is made. She recognized this in an image which is called the hazelnut image. She had a vision of the hazelnut, and she tangibly felt this, and she felt that she herself was this, and she was being loved. Small entity as she was, that she was this Divine Mother's child. And just as we can hold a hazelnut, she felt that she was being held in this way, lovingly, because a hazelnut can produce a tree. The tree of life is an expression used across the board, east or west. And then the face of the divine in all conditions, and how that beamed love, even on a cross. And that all creation is in the divine's wise care. We have nothing to worry about. That is why she said, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And so, like that, 16 revelations were there, including divine gifts of thanks to all those who serve the highest, for the God as a comforter to those, whether in good times or in bad, and there were plenty of bad times in her era. And the identification and the feeling of, in her religious case, Mary, the mother of Jesus, the glory of the divine, all of these, and ultimately that this entity that a Christian would call Christ dwells in the souls of all of those, all people, but especially those who love him. So there's a legacy to this. Julian's positive, hopeful message is beloved by many and held in high esteem by people across the board, east or west. And her teachings, enlightened as they are, going against maybe some conventional orthodox grains on sin, forgiveness, and the motherhood of God, these are unique in Western Christianity. And so, although she never went through the formal process, recognizing her as a saint, there's another thing I have to mention, because if we say women saints of East and West, we have to understand that in the West, there is a process, a formal process, and before various gradations are made to declare this truly was a saintly person. But what are the criteria? Great selflessness, great truth, and the capacity to pour out or to represent or to share the light that they themselves have discovered on their mystic journey. And this sometimes takes place as a manifestation of miracles. Now let us turn now to Eastern saints. And of course, there are so many. There is a book that I am referring to and have referred to, and I can walk you through this in case you want to get the book. But it is a publication originally on the birth centenary memorial of Sri Sharada Devi, the Holy Mother. And it is called Women Saints of East and West, exactly the title of this talk. It has a beautiful, useful foreword by Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, and it has an introduction by a devotee, Kenneth Walker, doctor, medical doctor. And it was originally published by Swami Purnananda, who really pioneered the London center of the Ramakrishna Mutt. And there's also useful input by Sir John Stuart Wallace. So a beautiful, well-edited book, but I'll read you through the various contents, the scope of this. After all the introductions and so on, the book is divided, and the Women Saints of Hinduism covers an enormous scope. It discusses the spiritual tradition among Hindu women, part of which I have mentioned, that the tradition of saintly women goes way back to the Vedic times. Not only that, but the acknowledgement of the presence of rishis, female rishis, indicating the equality and the availability of studying the Vedas. And then there are various Tamil saints that are discussed, including various saints. Andal is a great saint that it is discussed. Akka Mahadevi, Laleshwari or Lal Didi of Kashmir is mentioned. Mirabai is always included, of course. And the Maharashtra women saints collectively. And then there's Mahinabai, Gauribai, and then some women saints of Kerala. There were many, many women saints of Kerala. And so it goes on. And then, of course, there would be saints of Buddhism and Jainism. And even saints of Judaism are mentioned, and Sufism. Such a collection would be impossible to cover. So I will make do with some brief comments on one of Sri Ramakrishna's disciples. Imagine now a situation where there is a mysterious pull from a mysterious saint. This is described actually in a biography, Disciples of Ramakrishna. Actually, it's in Swami Chaitananda's version, They Lived with God. And I'm not beginning at the beginning because biographical details are not as significant or important or as exciting or interesting as the real point, turning point in a person's life. But we might talk about the Saint Gaurima, and maybe a few biographical details we can supply. She was born around about 1857, and she was an Orthodox Brahmin. And her mother was an erudite and accomplished lady, and she composed Bengali songs and wrote Sanskrit hymns, which were in fact published as a book. And her mother also knew some Persian and English. And so she brought up with a very religious bent of mind. But really, the pull came, I'm starting from there, at last in a mysterious way, having resisted any reference or visitation to Sri Ramakrishna. Because she was associated and related to Balaram Bose, devotee of Ramakrishna. And he had mentioned, you have never seen such a wonderful holy man. But of course, she was already of a spiritual bent and a renunciant bent at that. But he mentions he goes into samadhi every now and then. And if you do not see him, you will certainly miss something in your life. And Gaurima's reaction was, she smiled and replied, I have seen many, many monks in my life, and I have no desire to see any other. And if your holy man has real power, let him pull me, was her comment. Now this pull came at last in a mysterious way, and one morning Gaurima began her daily ritual to her deity. She first bathed the stone image of Vishnu and then was about to place it on the altar when she saw two live human feet there, without a body. At first she thought that it was an optical illusion, but observing carefully again and again, she saw only these two human feet. Gaurima was frightened. The hair on her body stood on end and her hands started trembling so much that she dropped the image. She then lost consciousness and fell to the floor. And after a few hours, Balaram's wife learned, that Gaurima was lying unconscious. So she went to her. And although she called her repeatedly, she couldn't get a response. Then Balaram came there and realized that Gauri-Ma was in Samadhi. And sometime later, Gauri-Ma regained a little outward consciousness and pointed to her heart. She felt that someone had tied a string to her heart and was pulling it. And she passed the whole day and night in semi-conscious state. The next morning, Gauri-Ma tried to leave without telling anyone, but the gatekeeper stopped her. And just then Balaram arrived and asked her, "Where do you want to go?" "Sister, would you like to meet the master in Dakshinaswar?" And although Gauri-Ma didn't answer, Balaram understood that her silence meant assent, agreement. He immediately ordered the coachman to get the carriage ready, and they left for Dakshinaswar with Balaram's wife and some other women. And when they arrived, they found Sri Ramakrishna seated in his room, winding thread around a stick and singing, "O mother, for Yashoda thou wouldst dance when she called thee her precious blue jewel. Where hast thou hidden that lovely form, O terrible Shama? Dance that way once more for me, O mother." And immediately after their arrival, Sri Ramakrishna finished winding the thread and cordially received them. Gauri-Ma understood that Sri Ramakrishna had attracted her heart. And this heart, she had indicated this attraction, he had indicated by winding the thread. Then when she bowed down to the master, she saw the same 2 feet that she had seen the previous day on the altar, and she was overwhelmed with joy and astonishment. And Sri Ramakrishna just smiled. He asked Balaram about Gauri-Ma, and then he talked to them about spiritual life. And while seeing them off, the master said to Gauri-Ma, come again. Come again means, in Ramakrishna's language, please, you have to come again. And so the next day, after bathing in the Ganga, Gauri-Ma went to Dakshinaswar with 2 pieces of cloth and her inseparable companion, Lord Vishnu. And as soon as she entered the master's room, she said, "I was thinking of you." And Gauri-Ma told him about herself and about her recent vision of the master's feet on the altar. And the master smiled and said, "If you had met me earlier, would you have practiced so much austerity, the austerity that she had practiced?" So that was her turning point. Already the foundation was there. It was in 1894 that Swami Vivekananda wrote from America to his brother disciples, "If you want any good to come, just throw your ceremonials overboard and worship the living God, the man God. Every being that wears a human form, God in his universal as well as individual aspect, spread the ideas." And he had also said, in Vrindavan, the Holy Mother had also reminded Gauri-Ma that the master said that your life was meant for serving women, the living goddesses. And so with that in mind, Gauri-Ma started some association of women, just as Sangamitra had done in Sri Lanka for Buddhism. Once the Holy Mother praised Gauri-Ma's love and steadfast devotion, saying, "It's amazing how Gauri-Ma has passed her life holding a stone image of the Lord." And Gauri-Ma treated this image as her living husband. Again, showing an attitude. Don't forget, Julian of Norwich showed the attitude of the motherhood of God. But on this occasion, she was looking at another aspect, that was seeing her ideal of God as her own husband. One day in 1916, Gauri-Ma went to visit Pelumat. Swami Brahmananda received her graciously and encouraged the monks to ask her about how she met the master. and about her itinerant days of austerities and tapasya. And one monk said, "We had heard that when you left home, you were a young girl. Weren't you afraid to travel by yourself and without any money?" And Gauri Ma replied, "My son, all fear is pertaining to the body. I had something with me so that no one could harm me." And then she said in a firm tone, "By the grace of the Master, I regard lustful persons as worms, and their place is always under the feet." And so we see immediately her spontaneous austerities and her spontaneous holiness. There is a saying that an organization succeeds not because it's big or because it is long established, but because there are people in it who live it, sleep it, dream it, and build future plans for it. Gauri Ma practiced this in her life. And following what the Master had asked her to do, she became one of the pioneers of education for women of modern India. She founded a beautiful educational institution according to the ancient ideals of India. And she trained the women of the ashram, but all the while she considered herself a maidservant of the ashram. And because she led such a pure, dedicated, and unostentatious life herself, she was a wonderful exemplar for her students. She used to tell them, "Remember, the beauty of a woman is not enhanced through clothes and cosmetics, but through physical and mental purity." As Gauri Ma grew older, her body began to fail, but she passed her days in various kinds of spiritual moods. And one day she told two nuns, "Look, I shall go to Vrindavan, so don't cry for me." At this time, if anyone asks any mundane questions, she told them, "Don't talk to me about the world anymore. Talk only about the Master, so that I will get joy and you will attain blessedness." Neither attachment nor delusion nor fear of death could touch Gauri Ma. She was absorbed in the bliss of the self. And then, of course, on Monday, 28th February, 1938, the day of Shivaratri, this is why I'm telling her life story here, the spring festival of Lord Shiva, Gauri Ma announced, "The Master is pulling the string." In the afternoon, she began to prepare herself for her final departure, and she asked her students to help her to get dressed. She put on a silk sari and shawl, and a flower garland was placed around her neck. She indicated that her chariot was coming. That night, she talked to her assistant, Durga Devi, about the forthcoming festival of the Master and advised her to follow the tradition. And the next morning, Tuesday, 1st of March, 1938, Gauri Ma handed over her beloved image of Vishnu to Durga Devi. She then felt relieved. She was quite cheerful the whole day and talked frequently about the Master. That evening, she uttered aloud 3 times, "Guru Sri Ram Krishna," and then started repeating her mantra silently. And at 8:15 p.m., Gauri Ma had passed away. And of course, her body was cremated the next day at the Kashipur cremation ground. And the body of her beloved, where the body of her beloved Guru, Sri Ram Krishna, had also been cremated. So here we find a spectrum of the lives of women saints, East and West, one more proximate to us in time, and they all act as a great inspiration, all developing different attitudes toward the same divine entity, but all giants in their mystic revelations, all sincere to the backbone. Some people hear these lives of saints and say, "But you know, these were all nuns, or these were all dedicated women like this. Should we have to do this?" But you see, in the story, there are many, many saints who lived also a married life. And we have to take cognizance also of this. And the more we study these lives, men and women, the more we get an insight into what is required in our own practice. Even though the ideal may be very high, at least we can progressively move toward it. And all the resources around us, what we call grace, is all around us and immediately available right now. We but, in Ramakrishna's language, have but to set our sails. It's not as mysterious as we think, this theological concept of grace. It is simply tuning in all our resources, our energy, to that highest, with great faith and confidence, with knowledge based on scripture, teacher, and our own direct experience. And we get the rewards of it immediately. So these are some wonderful examples, and all related to yesterday's celebration of International Women's Day. And we haven't even touched the lives of saints, including our own sister Nivedita, who remarkably was neither East nor West, and a wonderful amalgamation of the two. We'll finish this off now, repeating a wish for peace for all. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.